Alrighty, well, it's evening on my end, but whenever you're watching this, good to whatever time it is. Greetings and various assorted salutations. Welcome to the new unit, American Imperialism and World War I. This is from fall 2019, though if I don't make any major changes, I'll probably use this video again in its slides. Anyways, this is our new unit. Essentially, the big idea behind this unit that we're looking at is we've seen the Industrial Revolution, how America industrializes and builds up a massive consumer economy. We've seen westward expansion, where we see the U.S. expand out west, claiming territories and the resources they find there. Now we've reached the pinnacle of industrialism before the Great War, and that is going out into the world for resources and markets. And so the thing to keep in mind when you see the word imperialism is America's going out into the world for a reason. There's some stated reasons, and then there's some pragmatic reasons as well. So it's a story to tell. So our learning objectives are as follows. Introduce the core concepts and ideas to the new unit on Americans' colonial expansion involvement in the Great War. Now this lecture will focus entirely on imperialism. Now, this unit is going to cover some different parts in our textbook. In Chapter 11, or Topic 11, however they count it, it covers America Influence Grows, the Spanish-American War, the United States emerges as a world power. And then the second half of this unit, which will be in the next lecture, is on the Great War, which has 12.1, America enters World War I, 12.2, the home front during World War I, and 12.3, the end of World War I. Now, with the rise of capitalism, consumerism, and the Industrial Revolution, America needed to get out into the world. Our factories needed raw materials for manufacturing and places to sell those goods. Some of the places that we're going to see Americans go abroad is places like China, Japan, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and numerous other places. Before we get further along, I want to make sure that the key terms for this unit are conveyed. So for part 1, the key terms are as follows. Now you will note that there is the Quizlet link. I've split it into two things so as to simplify things. However, if you're one of those people who wants to look at all of them together, I recommend writing them down yourself and practicing by hand. The Quizlet app is a wonderful study tool, but there's nothing quite like making your own flashcards and learning key terms. I'll just read through them real quick. I recommend looking them up either before this lecture starts or afterwards on your own time. First up, we've got imperialism, Rough Riders, extractive economies, sphere of influence, Four-Acre Act, Platt Amendment, yellow journalism, open door policy, big stick diplomacy, dollar diplomacy, moral diplomacy, Emilio Anguanido, sorry if I mispronounced that, and Treaty of Paris, 1898. The Great War term list is much shorter. Here's the link for that. But we've got the Espionage Act, the Sedition Act, Convoy, Treaty of Versailles, Irreconcilables, Trench Warfare, and War Industries Board. Alrighty, let's get started. America on the world stage. Up to this point, the United States has really played what we would consider an isolationist policy. The United States really kind of wanted to... Many people came to America to get out of Europe's wars, and much of Europe had been in a near continuous state of wars since the end of Pax Romana. And so many people came to Europe to become Americans to get out of war. However, this becomes a change. Especially American leadership, but many critics begin saying, hey, the world's a big place out there, and America should step out into it. There's a variety of reasons as to why. Some believe to spread American democracy, some believe to expand our markets, and some argue for security as well. But in any case, America is going to be entering the world stage. But imperialism is one of those key terms you need to be aware of. It's basically There's the formal key term for it, but you can think of it this way. It's called going out into the world for resources. You'll notice that many of the imperial powers are European. And the reason for this is in Europe, there was always the mentality of get ready for the next war. And so that's why France held these territories. The Russian Empire always expanded this way. Britain created the empire where the sun never set. The idea was use the world's resources to build up your own so that you can fight in the next war back home in Europe. And so that's why almost all the imperial powers in this time period are European powers. Now there is a few exceptions. You've got the crumbling Ottoman Empire. Japan is just starting to pick up this game as well. And you're going to see the United States enter the world stage as a colonial power as well. So there's kind of this mentality, if I don't control it, somebody else will, and they'll use it against me. And this is one of the driving forces for imperialism in this time period, is this fear that if I don't control it, someone else will use it against me. Now we've got a very basic timeline of U.S. expansion. This is in U.S. History 1. This is in U.S. History 1. We acquire this, and most of this is U.S. History 1. But we start picking up territories. We buy Alaska from the Russians. Essentially, the Russians couldn't find a use for this land, and so the U.S. bought it. Partially, some bought it because we wanted to push another European power out of the New World. We will also acquire quite a bit of territory in the Treaty of Paris with the Spanish-American War, which we will spend quite a bit of time on that. We'll be talking about the war itself and yellow journalism in the coming days. We also pick up the Panama Canal. We'll watch a documentary, a very short documentary on that, written in what was it? It's a black and white documentary from, I believe, the 1920s, if I recall correctly. We also pick up Hawaii in this time period. Essentially, we acquire Hawaii out of security concerns. We don't want the British to hold it, but we pick it up kind of as a result of the Spanish-American War, because it's a good jumping-off point for moving resources. And then these are the few other territories that we get. Many of these territories, except for the Philippines, for the most part, the U.S. controls in some way, shape, or form to this day. So, but we're going to see a lot of sea ships. If you ever have the chance, there's quite a bit of seafaring in this time period. Very beautiful white ships, or as the Japanese recall, the black ships. The naval power becomes very important in this time period. Several books and documents are written on the importance of naval power, and everyone could see the success of the British Empire. Not a big army, but that's because they need to control the seas. Now, we're going to look at some examples of American imperialism. These are examples we won't be going into as much detail in the class itself, because we're a very short survey class. And so we just do not go into the detail that perhaps other channels might go into due to constraints and whatnot. So first up, American Japan. Already, the big concern that Japan had is China was carved up by Europeans, and Southeast Asia was pretty much becoming colonial territories by the British, the French, and the Spanish, etc. And so this kind of shows you what things looked like. India is no longer independent. In French Indochina is French territory. Eventually the U.S. would pick up the Philippines, but many of these territories, they're being snapped up. Now, China isn't ruled like India. Instead, China is kind of divided up into spheres of influence. Essentially, the idea behind the spheres of influence is one European power has kind of a trade monopoly almost in that area. And if it isn't a monopoly, they get favorable treatment over other groups. Places like Korea and Japan saw what was happening to China centuries before the imperialism we're talking about right now, and they closed their borders. However, Korea could not keep foreign powers out of its borders, and eventually be kind of controlled by the Chinese, and thus controlled by various other powers in this time period. Japan, however, was able to close itself off. The Tokugawa shogunate was remarkably successful in basically isolating Japan, except for one Dutch ship a year. But that's the key thing with Japan. You can see this map here. Do remember, you can always access my slides. It should be in the description, how to get to this slideshow. But now, the problem with the Europeans dividing up China into spheres of influence is the Americans are cut out. It means that we had to pay more to do business in places like Hong Kong and Macau and other places, because we just didn't have the influence. It wasn't our sphere. And so the United States wanted to advocate for free trade. But we'll talk about China in a second. Our hope was kind of to open up trade with Japan, because nobody really had trade relations with the Japanese. And so the U.S.'s hope was, maybe if we can get into Japan, we can have a trade relations deal exclusive with them and shut the Europeans out of there. Commodore Perry and the Black Ships, as pictured back here, they sailed in and negotiated a bit with the threat of violence, opened up Japan to trade. But we'll stay up here for a second. What's going to happen in Japan is going to go through rapid evolution. What happens in Japan is, when the U.S. opens up trade, there were many in Japan that wanted to open up to the West anyways, because there's this deep fear that if they didn't start taking on Western ideas, especially weapons and technology, there might not be an independent Japan. And so the Japanese would put forward the argument of anything Europeans or Americans can do, the Japanese can do too. And they'd actually have a pretty good run at this. The Japanese Empire would expand and grow and be an effective world power all the way up into World War II. So the United States is not the only ones going out into the world in this time period. The United States and Japan are late to the game, but that doesn't mean it's too late in the imperialism game. Just a map of the acquisitions. We'll talk about Hawaii in particular in this class. No. So basically, by the 1890s, the Hawaiian Islands were economically linked to the United States. We owned sugarcane plantations. Rich Americans owned sugarcane plantations. You had the Dole pineapple people. You had a lot of fruit growing in this region, and what had happened is, over the years, the rulers of Hawaii had made agreements with American planters and landowners, and these deals would go up and down, often to the loss of the local Hawaiians. The wealthy landowners eventually kind of came to see it as, if we don't control these islands, if these aren't on a U.S. territory, we might lose them. But the U.S. would outright seize these islands in the name of defense. Also, the white planters on the islands kind of blackmailed the United States into taking in Hawaii, because there wasn't really a lot of excitement in the U.S. to acquire Hawaii, or at least in the political leadership. However, when these planters threatened to join the British Empire, the United States agreed to, take on the territory. The key thing that you'll need to know for U.S. History 3 is there's a place called Pearl Harbor, and it's kind of a big deal. It's where the U.S. would park its Pacific Fleet. But anyways, what you're going to see time and time again, Hawaii is just one example. You have these big landowners who are American citizens living abroad, and they would like to have advantages and resource control that maybe they couldn't accomplish in the United States per se, but they could use the U.S. government to, well, set up a government in that area that could benefit the landowners. But we're going to see this especially in Latin America with the banana wars. Now, talking about China again, we have U.S. trade and intervention in China, which basically translates to the Boxer Rebellion. What happens in with the Boxer Rebellion is it's an interesting story, and I really wish we had more time to investigate it in our classroom. But it's kind of a neat and interesting story to tell. I'll give you a very generic summary of it, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. So our textbook almost exclusively focuses on what the U.S. is trying to get out of it. The goal of the U.S. is to open up trade in China, get rid of the spheres of influence, and create an open free trade market. The reason behind free trade, and especially in this time period, is not to even the playing field, but to give the U.S. an advantage. Essentially, with these different European powers with their spheres of influence, everyone had to pay a premium except for that European power in that place. However, with free trade, it's survival of the economic fittest. And so what the United States' big advantage was we were an industrialized giant. England was industrialized, sure, but they had a big empire, and we could compete with them, go toe-to-toe. Germany was late to get organized. They only slapped themselves together in 1871 in opposition to the French. So they were really late to the colonizing game. So they really needed spheres of influence to get an edge in their areas. Likewise, the French, they had a lot of areas that they controlled, but their industrialization was a bit behind England's. And so the United States, our big goal was we pushed for free trade because we knew that in a straight-up even fight, we'd win through sheer manufacturing power. But let's not focus on that, because you can read that on the slide here. You'll hear about it. What I'd rather focus on is where the Boxer Rebellion comes out of. Because while the United States is able to take advantage of it, and, well, China's destroyed in the process until the communists come along, what happens is in China, the Boxers are fed up with these different European powers. They're fed up with foreign influences. They're fed up with the growth of Christianity. And so the Boxers rise up and they believe in restoring the empress, the Chinese empire, to its former glory. And so what they do is, well, the first thing they do is they drive back the foreigners into kind of the diplomatic quarters of China. They slay and murder massive amounts of Chinese Christians. If anyone truly lost everything in this, the Chinese Christian community was the one that suffered the dearest in the Boxer Rebellion. They died in the thousands. But the Boxers, they initially had the element of surprise. However, the European powers and the massive army that responded to them would strike back with force. And so the Boxers, while their equipment was all over the place, some of them were emperors, the empire soldiers. Some of them were just independents. Some of them were different warlord groups. The Boxers were kind of a motley crew. Their biggest advantage is they almost always outnumbered their enemies. The problem was they didn't necessarily have the technology or the coordination. And it showed in the battles. Essentially what happens is 8 major powers kind of come together to mobilize and beat back the Boxers. You've got the Empire of Japan and Russia send tons of troops because, one, the Empire of Japan sees this as a golden opportunity to move into Asia. And they're really close. Also, Russia has a lot of troops poised in Manchuria, or ready to move in on Manchuria. So they send a lot of troops. The British have to move their troops a bit further away. A lot of troops, in fact, if you looked up at this picture, they actually sent some of their colonial troops from India. They're the Indian troops under the British flag in to kind of contain the Boxer Rebellion. You have the Third French Republic in there as well. The United States deploys a number of troops from the Philippines. The Germans are present. The Kingdom of Italy has a presence, and Austria-Hungary. A lot of people dismiss Austria-Hungary, but fun little fact, if you're a fan of The Sound of Music, this is the little conflict where the Von Trapp becomes a famous naval commander. So kind of a fun little music history in there as well. But these nations, even though they speak a multitude of different languages, they all have different agendas. The Japanese want to take land, the Russians want to take land, the British want to protect their investments, the United States wants open trade, etc., etc. These armies are able to do massive amounts of damage. Small, well-equipped, European-style trained troops are able to hold down positions. The Gatling gun gets used in this conflict. I believe there was one general who kind of commented that with a railroad and a Gatling gun, he could take on the world. You see these industrial nations crushing the non-industrialized Boxers. It's a brutal campaign. Here's a Japanese card that shows the different naval forces that were present in this conflict. And I just think this would be a really interesting time period to study. Because you have a multinational force, not necessarily out for good, but they are united in a rather curious way, even though they all have their own agendas. There's a higher quality version of that picture. But, the other conflict that we have, I do apologize if things are a bit out of order. The ordering of these different events isn't too terribly important as long as you remember they're before World War I for our purposes of my U.S. History 2 study. It's more important that you understand the concepts, and the timeline is just not as big of a deal at this point. Anyways, we've got Roosevelt working with Japan. So, as I said before, the Japanese kind of had this mentality of they didn't want to become like China, and instead of kind of bowing to that the foreign pressure, they would become an imperial power on par with any European or American. They developed their own ships, they redeveloped their own navy, and then they take a chance to prove themselves, and they launch a sneak attack. This is a common tactic in Imperial Japanese military history, and attack Russia while they're in China. It is a gruesome series of battles. The Japanese, though, are doing massive amounts of damage and inflict heavy casualties. Now, the Japanese suffer heavy casualties as well, but a lot of people didn't expect the Russians to lose as bad as they were. Now, if you ever get the chance to go into deeper topics with World War I, you would realize that the Russian military they never fully industrialized, and so Japan definitely had a huge edge over them. However, in this time period, there's a big perception that Europeans were superior to everyone else. And the Japanese sorely reminded people that no, it's a matter of what you've got and how you use it, more so than where you are on the map and your ethnic identity. But no, we've got some pictures from there. What happens is President Theodore Roosevelt negotiates the treaty between the Japanese and the Russians. He gets a Nobel Peace Prize for it, actually. And this is another example of the U.S. entering the world stage. With the Spanish-American War, which we'll study, we get directly involved. With the Boxer Rebellion, we're trying to establish free trade. But in the Russian and Japanese conflict, the Russo-Japanese War, the U.S. is now playing a mediator role as a diplomat. And so not only are we taking an interest in things that we personally gain things, we're also taking an interest in just meddling in affairs of the world in general. And this is a trend that continues to grow throughout this time period. And we will study it in examples of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. and the Caribbean, things like that. But the Empire of Japan will be back in U.S. History 3. It'll kick off U.S. History 3 with the Second World War. But rolling on down. Now we're going to go into more detail into the U.S. in Latin America, because the U.S. is going to define Latin America as our sphere of influence. This is where we will have our influence. Theodore Roosevelt is a good example of this mentality. Essentially what Theodore Roosevelt says is he comes up with a type of diplomacy called big stick diplomacy. Speak softly and carry a big stick. Under Theodore Roosevelt, the U.S. military and its Navy in particular will expand dramatically so that it can have more influence in the world. We'll get a chance to read about some of these different military interventions, but essentially you start having very rich American businessmen turning up in these different places, and to protect their investments, they sometimes call upon the State Department and therefore the Marine Corps. So if you're going into the Marines, there's a fair amount of history of Marines being down here, because who guards the embassies of America? The Marine Corps. And often, when there was military action needed out of an embassy in Latin America, the Marines were the first ones, in some cases the only ones sent in. So, kind of an interesting thing to keep in mind. But now we would also adopt another foreign policy under the next president. We would adopt what would be called dollar diplomacy. Whereas big stick diplomacy operates under this mentality of American power to protect American interests, dollar diplomacy also believes in we put money into something, so we should have say in how it's being run. We have oil operations in Mexico and Venezuela. We invest, there's lots of money being invested into Latin American infrastructure, and some of that is going towards, telling Latin American countries, okay, structure your government this way, charge taxes this way, so that our businessmen can profit in your country. But now, while dollar diplomacy is all about the Benjamins, that doesn't mean we don't use the military. If you'll notice, the timeline shows that there are troops running around in this time period as late as 1933. Essentially, the Great Depression is about the only thing that slows down our heavy military intervention in Latin America. But now, when President Woodrow Wilson comes into office, he's going to operate under something called moral diplomacy. He appoints the familiar figure of William Jennings Bryan as Secretary of State, and Woodrow Wilson is against imperialism. We'll hear about it in his 14 points as World War I rages. But essentially what he believes is that the United States should act as a moral compass for the world and guide other countries to being better. And adopting democracy, adopting free trade, adopting these things because they are good, according to Wilson's moral diplomacy. Now, big stick involves military power. Dollar diplomacy involves dollar power. Moral diplomacy argues for moral superiority. All of these will result in military actions. Because you'll notice 1912, early 1900s, and Theodore Roosevelt's diplomacy days as president, all these operations are happening in these time periods. While we have different mentalities to approaching the diplomacies, they all result in military action a lot. So, students in my class, I'd like for you to know the difference between big stick, dollar, and moral diplomacy. I recommend looking at the key terms, maybe looking in the textbook. and we'll do an activity that looks at the different diplomacies in class. But I want you to make sure you know the differences between them, but remember that in many cases they often produce very similar results, which is interventions in the military style. So I recommend reading over this chart on your own time because it really kind of gives you the idea of what are the different approaches. In fact, this chart is probably the best one you'll get for seeing the difference between Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. 3 different presidents, 3 different mentalities, often carried out the same, executed in a similar manner. And with that concludes this presentation. I hope this helps introduce the imperialism unit. And with that, I guess over and out, and until later.